Hi everyone, welcome back to Feather Stitch House. My name's Rebecca and each week on this channel I post videos about embroidery and textile art to help inspire you to explore your creativity and maybe even start a new hobby. Each year on this channel we create a 52-week project called Winging It, and these videos are improvised textile art pieces where I show you my process and hopefully take some of the fear away from trying something new with your fabric and thread. So far this year we've been creating something of a fabric journal, and we've been creating pieces that reflect what's happening in our lives and what's happening in the world around us as we move through the year. So in January we created a watery landscape scene. In February, we took inspiration from nesting birds and the first flowers that are appearing and created a snowdrop inspired piece. In March, we observed all the colour that was bursting out of the ground in spring flowers. And last month, we took almost like a snapshot of ourselves at this moment in our lives and created a self-portrait. Now, I know a lot of you were a little bit intimidated by that project. I do hope that you'll go back and give it a go when you're feeling more confident. But this month I thought we'd pull it back and do something a little bit more straightforward. And I've got some quite exciting news to share as we go through this. It's going to be a different kind of video. It's going to be mostly stitching, and I want to give you a little bit of my backstory and tell you about some exciting developments in my life as we go along. So I hope you'll stick around for my ramblings as we stitch our panel. I'm taking inspiration from a book called Haggitude by Sharon Blackie that I'm reading at the moment, and a gift that I received for my birthday of some inspiration cards that are based on ancient stories and folk tales through history. Don't be alarmed, there's nothing dodgy, they are just conversation starters and points of inspiration to get you thinking about journaling, storytelling and creating art. And I will explain a little bit more about the particular images that have helped inspire this piece. So gather all your bits and pieces and let's get stitching. Okay, so we've got our panel set up for this month. I've got my rectangle marked in with plenty of space around the edge, just for overhang and whatever. And I've worked out that 4 portrait panels will fit almost exactly along the length of 3 landscape panels. So we're going to work portrait again this month, and I'm going to attach together my January, February and March panels horizontally, and then we'll do 4 vertical panels that will fit underneath them. So that's the way I'm working, and that's how I'm going to build my wall hanging ultimately. So I've got my batting, put my fabric over the top, and I've marked out my rectangle, which is 16 centimetres wide and 24 centimetres deep. I've got about 4 or 5 centimetres border all the way around. Now I've taken inspiration this month from a gift that I got for my birthday at the end of April, and this is based on the writing of Sharon Blackie. Now Sharon Blackie is an academic, she's a psychologist, and she particularly focuses on the experience of middle-aged and older women in Western society, and she writes a lot about the experience of women going through menopause and what menopause means for us. And my friend introduced me to Sharon Blackie a little while ago, and I opened this gift for my birthday and was really delighted. And there is absolutely stunning artwork in this set by Hannah Willow. And I'm not going to show you all the cards, but I ripped the package open, opened the box, and just was blown away by how pretty and how inspirational these are. Now Sharon Blackie studies ancient stories. That's one of her areas of academic study, and she's looked at folk stories and ancient sort of fairy tales and things like that through lots of different cultures through history. And a lot of our modern fairy tales and stories really reduce women to just princesses or evil stepmothers. And actually, if you look into the canon of storytelling through history, women have a much stronger role. And what she's done is looked for patterns in those stories and the archetypal characters, situations, and places that come up repeatedly. Now, these stories were designed to teach and educate people in the society in which they came from. And so these stories that are mostly lost to us are supposed to teach us something about what our role is in the world. And so when I flicked through, a few of the cards really stood out to me. And I thought, let's do a piece of work that's based around some of these old fashioned stories because they are really significant to me in my life at the moment. So we're trying to be journalistic, we're trying to record our experience through the year, and I thought this is a key moment in my life. I'll explain a little bit more about why later. So the first that stood out to me was the meadow, and this is one of the archetypal places that comes up in ancient stories. Now, meadows are supposed to be places where we can flourish but also regenerate, and I think it's so pretty. I love the rabbit there. I think it's so restful. Another card that stood out to me was this one, and again I really love the artwork, and it's all about the threshold. And so doorways, gateways and thresholds often appear in old stories to signify a significant moment in the life of the character. And then the third one is the picture of the Selkie. Now the Selkie is a character from mostly Scottish stories, and she was a woman who would change shape. She's sort of the Scottish version of a mermaid. Rather than having a fish tail, she had a seal's tail, and sometimes she would appear as the seal and sometimes she would appear as the woman. And so I was thinking about all of this, and I was also thinking about how women often hide their skills and their qualities, and that put me in mind of secret gardens. And so I thought this month we would create a threshold that is hiding something really special. And so I was looking at pictures of postern gates and secret garden doors on the internet, and this is one of the ones that caught my eye. And I thought, wouldn't it be fun if we could make a door that opens and reveals something behind? And so that's where we're going to go. Now, there are really specific reasons why I'm creating this piece. This is the sketch that I have drawn, and I thought we could do maybe some English paper piecing to create a wall, and then we could maybe do a bit of quilting to make a door that goes inside it, and maybe do some stitching through it, and then we're going to make that door lifted away from the surface so that it can open and reveal a scene behind. And I thought we could do some embroidery against the wall, not like this because obviously we don't need a wall if we do that. Now I'm going to put a meadow behind because that's really important to the point in my life that I'm at. It's worth you having a think about what you're going to put behind. Have a think about what you feel like you're stepping into. So you might not be at a significant turning point, but most of us find ourselves at doorways and gateways in our lives at various points. You've got a few weeks before we get to what's behind the door. Have a little think about not necessarily what you are stepping into, but perhaps what you would hope this next phase of your life or the rest of this year should hold. So we're going to start with the door, and I'm just cutting out my door shape and want to keep it pretty whole so that I can use that void that I've just created. I've sized my picture so that it fits in the frame that I've drawn on my fabric, and I just want to fold the bits back to the edges of that, and then I can lay my picture on my backing just lined up with the borders there, and I can use that hole that I've just created by cutting out the door as my template. So that's going to locate my door on my panel. I'm going to keep hold of that because we're going to use it next week. So don't throw your template away. And then we've got our door that fits really nicely into that space, and that's just going to help me locate my door on my panel. So I've fished out some fabrics. I've got a little scrap of wadding here. Then I've got this dark charcoaly grey for the front of the door, and I've got this green gingham for the back of the door. I think it's a little bit more lively, a little bit more fun without being chaotic, because I don't want it to draw attention away from the meadow, but I do want the inside of the door to be more colourful than the outside. And I'm going to start by just drawing around my door shape on my wadding, and I want this to be the right size, so I don't need any excess on this. So I'm just going to draw around the template, cut that out. And then I'm going to do the same with my fabrics. So I want 2 door shapes, but this time I want to come in from the edge of the fabric to give myself a seam allowance. So I've got my front, my wadding and my back, and what we want to do is create a sandwich like this, so that we've got a front and back on our door and it can open like that. And there are lots of ways of doing this, and I think I would have changed the way I've done this a little bit, but watch the video, watch my mistakes, and then you can avoid making them. Because my wadding is the right size for my door and the fabric has got seam allowance on it, I'm just going to tack these 2 pieces together so I can treat it as one layer. So I'm going to use the side that's got the markings on because the fabric's reversible. If you're using a fabric that isn't reversible, you need to make sure you're stitching this on the wrong side of your fabric. And I'm just going to put 2 little cross stitches just to hold that wadding to that fabric while I'm working with it. So you don't need to worry too much about this. In hindsight, I should have stitched from the other side so the knots were on the front, what will be the front of the door. It didn't matter in the end, I managed to get the stitches out. So now I'm going to put that right side up on my mat, and I'm going to lay the back of my door right side down, so it's right sides together. And I'm just going to pin these together to hold them in place. I'm just using wonder clips so that they don't move. And notice where I'm placing the clips, because I want to leave an opening so that I can turn this through. So I'm using my clips to mark where that opening is going to be. I've just got some machine cotton, I'm knotting the end, and I'm going to back stitch around the shape of the door. So I'm going to start here, back stitch all the way around, and then I'm going to stop on the other side of that red one. So this space in the middle is going to be left open so that I can turn my door through and get a padded door shape. So to do back stitch, I'm going to come up just a little way away from that clip and go backwards to the clip and stitch through. And then on the back, I'm going to come forward 1 stitch length beyond that first stitch. So there's a gap now between the first stitch and where my needle's coming through. And then I go back to the end of that first stitch to close that gap. And I'm going to rock forward 1 stitch length beyond my stitch and then come back to the beginning of that previous stitch. And that's how you do back stitch. So I'm just rocking forwards and then coming back to meet the previous stitch, and I'm just going to back stitch all the way around that door shape. The only thing you need to think about is that when you get to the corner, you need your needle to go right into the corner. So you need to make a stitch that lands right at the corner of your door shape. And that way, when you turn it through, you're going to get a really sharp corner. Okay, so I've backstitched all the way around and left my gap here. And so now we need to turn it through. Before I do that, I'm going to turn back the seam allowance around that gap that I've left, that opening. So I'm just going to press it with my fingers, fold it back over the batting and finger press, and then I'm going to do the same on the backing piece so that the folded edges line up with each other. That's just going to help me close that gap. And I also need to do a little bit of trimming, so I'm going to cut off the corners. When we turn this through, these corners that face out are going to face inwards when we turn it through. And so we need to take some of the bulk out so that we get a nice sharp corner. So I'm just going to cut off the corners, and again around this curve at the moment excess fabric is going out from the curve, but when we turn it through it's going to be reversed, so it's going to be facing into the curve, and we need to take out some of the bulk. So I'm just going round snipping from the edge of the fabric up to that stitch line. Just got to be really careful that you don't snip your stitches. You can make notches if you want to, so you can cut out little V shapes like that just to take out some of the bulk, but snipping like this will work as well because it'll allow fabric to fold over itself when it's turned through. And when you've snipped all the way around, just get rid of those bits. You can then turn through, and I always start with the corners and then turn it through so that you've got right sides out now, and you can use your fingers to just ease out that curve. And then just to get sharp corners, if you've got a point turner you can use that, but I don't, because I don't do this kind of stuff often enough. But I'm just getting the closed blade of my scissors into that corner there just to make sure it's a point and that there's not lots of fabric looped in. Because we snip those corners off, that's fairly straightforward to do. They're my little cross stitches, and so now I'm going to fold back my seam allowances, and I'm just going to clip that opening together to hold it while I'm sewing, and we're going to do a ladder stitch to make an invisible closure. So I'm going to bring my machine cotton up through the fold of the seam allowance. I'm coming up through the green. I'm going to go back a little bit because those stitches are a bit loose. You can tuck any loose ends or loose stitches inside. Popping across to the grey, and I want to slide my needle a little way, maybe less than half centimetre, a couple of millimetres, along the fold in that grey fabric, and I'm going to pull my thread through. Now I'm going to hop back to the green and slide my needle along the fold of that seam allowance. Then I'm going to hop back across to the grey and then back to the green. So what we're doing is making a kind of ladder really across that join. So we're going along the seams to make horizontal stitches, and then we're putting a vertical stitch as we're looking at it that crosses over the join between the two layers of fabric. And this is fairly magic. I'm trying to keep the stitches a bit loose so that you can still see them. This is fairly magical because when we've done a few stitches we can pull on that working thread and the ladder closes up and the two layers are pulled together and you have no sign of any stitching. Now if this is too complicated you could just do a whip stitch, but those stitches will show. This way you get a completely invisible join, between your two layers of fabric. So I'm going to stitch all the way along that and close up the gap. So now we've got going, I can tell you a little bit more about why we're making a doorway or a threshold, because this is totally reflective of this moment in my life. So like I said, we want to be journalistic this year in the panels that we make, and we're trying to capture what's happening in our lives and in the world around us as we progress through the year. And in order to make sense of this, I need to go back quite a long way in time. So bear with me, it's going to be story time this week. Talked about ancient stories. Here's a fairly new story. So I, as you know, am a teacher. I've been teaching English and English literature in a British secondary school recently. And I've been doing that actually for the last 20 years. Teaching is all I ever wanted to do. I knew from the age of 5 years old that I wanted to be a teacher. And after a little deviation during my early 20s, when I was 29, I started teacher training and qualified in 2004-5. And I've been teaching in schools ever since and have absolutely loved it. I genuinely felt like I'd found my calling, and it's been an absolute joy to be a teacher. And that carried on until 2011 when my daughter was born. I'd planned to be on maternity leave during her early years. So I left in 2011 to have my daughter, and was having a lovely time being a mum again and having a new baby girl. And when she was 12 weeks old, I got really, really poorly, really poorly. So it began with some pain in my knees. I thought I got a housemaid's knee, and within 6 weeks, every joint in my body had essentially turned to stone, and I really couldn't do anything. I couldn't walk, I couldn't climb stairs, I couldn't turn taps on, I couldn't hold a knife and fork, I couldn't lift the kettle. I just felt like an old woman. And so I'd gone from being a new mum with a tiny baby to essentially being a really old lady who couldn't do anything for themselves. And I was in my 30s at this time, and it was shocking and really scary. And so after a long process of testing and seeing consultants, I was diagnosed with rheumatoid arthritis, and it was really severe as well. Every single joint in my body, even my jaw, was affected. And without any planning, I found myself in need of a really lengthy career break. And it was actually 4 years before I was able to return to my job as a teacher. And so in 2015, I was well enough to return to teaching, and that's what I've been doing ever since. Right, so I'm going to pause there because I've stitched along. So I'm just going to finish that thread off with a quilter's knot and pull that through, and then I'm going to take my thread back through in between the layers, just find a little space between some stitches, bring it out anywhere, and then I can pull that thread taut, press down on the scissors and snip, and the end of that thread will disappear into the door. So that's essentially my door. It's not perfect, it'll do. And so we're going to add some quilting stitches because at the moment it's a bit of a bag, it's loose, and we want those layers to be stitched together. So I'm bringing my template back in, and I want to cut out this panel at the bottom of the door. So I'm folding my door in half so that I can make a hole along that line because I want to keep the aperture complete. And I'm just going to cut that panel out, and again I'm going to use the aperture to mark on my door where the panel needs to be. So I'm just going to mark the corners in. I can do the rest with a ruler, and I'm going to mark some vertical lines that I can stitch along as well to give the sense that this is made of almost like tongue and groove panels that lock together. So I'm just drawing those in. I've got the wrong ruler really. Need to get my quilting ruler so that I can put in some lines. I'm just doing 1 centimetre lines across the front of that. I'm using a white heat erase pen, lining up my 1 centimetre line with the edge of that panel. And I've got this lovely variegated thread, and it's a nice sort of cool green. I like the fact that it's variegated because it's going to give some interest to the stitching on the door. So I'm just going to thread my needle, and I put a quilter's knot in the end, and we're going to hide that knot inside by taking our thread through in between the layers. I'm sliding my needle between some stitches and coming out just up from the corner, and I'm just pulling that knot through. Just need to ease it through so it disappears inside. And I start with back stitch here and then change my mind, because I realise that if we do back stitch, we're going to have a neat door front and the back is going to look awful, because you get a sort of really rough looking stem stitch on the back. And so what I decided was that there was a better solution. And so what we're going to do is something called holbein stitch. It's sometimes called double running stitch. You basically go round and do running stitch. So your stitches look the same on the back and the front. You've got just straight lines, and then you go round again, or you work back on yourself with a running stitch again, filling in the gaps. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to work my way round with running stitch, and then I'm going to work round again, filling in the gaps. And if that's not clear, hopefully it will be a bit clearer when we get to that point. So unusually for me, I'm keeping the gaps between my running stitches the same size as the stitches themselves, and that means that the finished stitch will look nice and even. Okay, so back to the story then. I'm picking up the story in 2015, and I had gone back to teaching, and very quickly I just found my groove again and was back into the plan and had an absolute blast. I loved it and worked away really hard, rebuilt the English department, created a whole new curriculum, just thoroughly enjoyed myself and felt totally fulfilled. And then of course in 2020 COVID happened, and because of the medication I was on to control my arthritis, I was forced to shield, and so I had to go home in the middle of February 2020, and I didn't actually return to school until September 2020, and felt just really insecure, because you have to get into a very particular mindset to not leave your house for 7 months. And it was really hard to come back out of that. And then, of course, in January 2021, the second lockdown happened in the UK, and I was back to shielding. So I had about 8 weeks back in the world. I think it wasn't even January. People who were shielding were sent home in November. So I was in school again from September to the middle of November. Then I was at home again, and then I didn't go back again until May 2021. So all that time I was still teaching. I was working from home, and I was being beamed onto the wall on a projector, a bit like the Wizard of Oz, into a classroom where children were being supervised. I taught my full timetable. I didn't miss a day. I didn't miss a lesson. We just taught away, and teaching really offered me a little bit of sanity. It was my way of keeping connected with the world, and I felt like I was doing a really good job, even though I couldn't be in a school environment. And then I went back into school in May once COVID cases had really significantly dropped in the UK. And although I was happy to be back in contact, I felt really vulnerable because I'm immunosuppressed and I just felt really vulnerable. Now, during lockdown, because I wasn't commuting and because there were no exams and things like that, I had a lot more time than I would normally have as a teacher. And I really got back into sewing in a really serious way. I'd never really stopped, but I had more time to be able to do it. And to cut a very long story short, I made a little felt alphabet that my husband thought would be really great as a kit. And from that conversation, Feather Stitch House was created, and we set up a business knowing that my days in teaching were numbered, that because of my health I wouldn't be able to get through to retirement probably. And we thought, let's try now to set up something that might give me an independent income so I can make a living on my own terms. And so that was ticking away in the background, and I did what I could. We made some kits, we set up a website and launched the business in 2021. So I, in the meantime, went back into school and just couldn't feel settled from May until the end of the academic year. Just felt really vulnerable, quite scared, very unsettled. And we just had no idea what was going to happen with COVID. So I asked my employer, who was very sensitive and very compassionate, if I could take a year out. So I've gone all the way around with my running stitch. So now I'm going to keep a close eye on the back. I'm going to come back up at the beginning of my stitching, right in the corner. And I'm going to work back the way that I came with running stitch. So I'm just making sure my needle is coming through at the right point on the back, and then making sure I'm coming through at the right point on the front. And I want these stitches to fit exactly in the spaces left by my first layer. Now if you want to, you could just leave it at running stitch because that will look the same on the front and the back, but I want a more solid line. And so this is a really clever double-sided stitch. That means that you get the look of back stitch on the front and the back of your work. So both sides are going to look like they're back stitched, but they aren't. So it's a really good way of getting the same effect on both sides. So there you go, that's the front looking back stitched, and that's the back also looking back stitched. So I'm just going to work back the way that I came, filling in the gaps between the stitches and completing that line around my panelling. So my employer very graciously agreed to me taking the next academic year off. So I didn't leave my job. I planned to go back in September 22, but I took that academic year off, and during that year things really started to get going with Feather Stitch House. I started the Winging It project. We made a felt book and I just had a great time. Started doing a few shows, promoted kits, got quite a following on Instagram, and things just really started to gain momentum and grow, and I absolutely loved that year. It was fabulous, and I decided that I probably, when I went back, I needed a little bit of a change. And I was working for a multi-academy trust, so that's like a federation of lots of schools that are all run by the same management team. And so when I went back into teaching in 2022, I moved to a different school. And I have to say, when I went back, nothing felt the same. I just could not find my mojo. and I'd loved teaching so much for so long, and it just didn't feel right. And at first I thought it was the school, because I'd gone back into an enormous school, like massive, and I'm not a big crowds kind of person. And I thought maybe it's the school. So I looked for another job and got a job as head of English at a school that couldn't be more different. It was absolutely tiny, by far the smallest school I've ever worked in. And so in September 23, I started work there, and it was no different. And almost immediately, I knew that I'd made a really big mistake, and I just couldn't settle, couldn't feel happy in the role. But I'd committed to it, and it's unusual to jump ship partway through an academic year. Normally you work through to the end of the year, but I thought probably I'm going to leave at the end of this year, but I'll see it through and I'll keep working hard. And then at the beginning of this year, as some of you will know, my mum died really suddenly and in a really horrible way, and it completely floored me. It was such a shock, and I know lots of people experience loss like this, but I think what happens is, in amongst the grief, you realise that life is actually very short, and it made me reflect quite a lot on my situation, on my own health, and I realised that I needed a change. And although it seemed quite sudden, I think this had been brewing for a very long time. And so I now had no mum, a dad who was nearly 90, who was now living alone. And I realised that the only thing I could really do was to leave teaching. And so I've handed in my notice. And at Easter, I left my job as a teacher. And so now, quite scarily, I don't have a job. This is what I'm doing, and I've decided that Feather Stitch House is never really going to do what I want it to do if I don't give it my full attention. And so we are not a business that is profitable yet. I'm not making a salary, but I never will if I don't give it my all. And so I am no longer a teacher, and this should feel scary, but it weirdly it doesn't. And at this point, I have to give some credit to my husband, who couldn't be more supportive. And I know that not everybody is in this position, and sometimes you just have to just keep working through it. And I do recognise how fortunate I am to be in a position where I can leave my job, and we aren't going to immediately lose our home or anything like that. It's not going to be an easy ride. We've just lost one of our household salaries, but he has been so enthusiastic and so supportive. Just got to bring my meadow card back in because I just need it to inspire me. He's so supportive and so encouraging. He really is my biggest fan, and he's a very rare, I think, example of a very special kind of man. And he is a teacher. It's not his dream job, but he's willing to do it because he believes in me and he believes in our business. And so I am on the threshold of something very different and very new. Now, I don't know for certain that I'm stepping into a meadow. I hope I am, but I don't know that I am. But this is what I'm hoping for. So when I stitch my meadow behind the door, it's a kind of hope that I'm coming into a time of refreshing. So that's why we're making this door. Right, I lost a bit of footage here, have to be honest, and what footage I did have had no sound. So that's why I'm doing a voiceover for this video. don't know what was going on with my microphone, but I'm going to try and create the top of the door. Now you could just do the same again and panel it, but because clearly I like to make my own life very difficult, I want to do a cutout because I want a little bit of my meadow to peek through, because I think I wouldn't have made the jump if I didn't have an idea that things were going to be better if I left teaching. So I want a bit of a sign peeking through of the good things that are behind the door. So the door really is all about the fact that for me, teaching became a barrier rather than the meadow. So when I first started teaching, teaching was like my meadow. It just gave me joy. It made me feel fulfilled. I felt really fruitful. But over time, it turned into a brick wall and a barrier. And so that's the point that I'm at. And so that's what we're doing. So I've drawn my aperture shape and I've cut it out. And what I'm doing here is I've made my notches like I did before around that curve. And I'm just folding back this seam allowance. And obviously I'm going to have a little bit of batting showing once I've done this, which I can trim away. So I've just snipped into the corners and I've made notches around the curve and I'm just folding these back. Now, I did say earlier, watch this and learn from my mistakes. I would absolutely not do it like this if I was making it again. So I would have cut the hole in the batting before I started, and I would have made the hole before I did the rest, because this was really fiddly and far too difficult. So I flipped it over. I'm just marking in the seam allowance on the back, and I'm just going to repeat the process. So I'm just folding under the seam allowance, and then once that's folded back, I can go in and trim back the batting, and I'm trying to separate out the layers so that I don't accidentally cut the front and back fabric. So this is me just working out how to do this. It just made it so difficult for myself. So if you're wanting a hole in your door so that you can see through it, my advice is make the hole first and then quilt the rest of the door, because it's going to be so much easier if you do that. You can do it like this. It did work. It's not the neatest finish, but yeah, do the hole first and then stitch the layers of the door together. So yeah, I hope that I'm stepping into a meadow, and it's been about 3 weeks since I left, and I do genuinely feel like I am being regenerated. I feel the rightness of it, which I think is helping to take away some of the fear. And I think sometimes when you make a big leap, like I've just done, you've got to go with your gut. And I do feel like I'm in the right place for the first time in a long time, and that's making it a lot easier. Whether I'll keep feeling like that or not, I don't know. But at the moment, it feels okay. And like I say, my family are so supportive. I feel more creative again, and I'm getting so much more creative work done, and that's making me feel better. And so that's really why those 3 cards, those 3 archetypes that we started out with are so significant for me, because in some ways I am the Selkie at the moment. I'm changing my form. I'm moving from being a teacher to being who knows what else. Maybe a businesswoman, maybe a textile artist, I don't know. So I am shape-shifting, I'm changing, and I think women have lots of moments like this because we have children, we give birth and our bodies change. We go through menopause, so another massive change happens there. And I think that is the phase that I'm in. So I've got my doorway that I'm stepping through. I've got my changing identity, my changing role, and I've got the meadow that I hope I'm stepping into. Now, the reason the meadow really stood out to me is that we don't often think of a place of regeneration and rest as also being a place of fruitfulness. And I really love that idea. So I've got a plant in my garden called a strawberry tree, and it's a really unusual plant because it flowers and fruits at the same time. And that's quite unusual in nature. If you've got a plant in your garden that also flowers and fruits simultaneously, I'd love to hear about it because I'm finding it absolutely fascinating at the moment. So I do feel like I'm coming back to life, like I'm regenerating, and I'm feeling more rested and more at peace. But I also feel like I'm being really productive as well. And so the first really major change, I should just say, by the way, that I'm ladder stitching this just like I did to close up the gap. I'm just going round now with a ladder stitch, joining these two layers together. That's what's going on there, and it's just frayed a little bit in the corner, so you'll see me jabbing at it a little bit with a needle to try and get all the fibres back inside. Yeah, so one of the major changes that has happened is that we have launched some workshops, and that's the really big deal for us at the moment. So we've wanted to do workshops for about 2 years, and because I was teaching full time, we just couldn't get to a point where there was enough capacity to be able to offer them. And so it's been delayed and delayed. And finally, we're at a point where I have capacity to do it. And so on the 1st of May, we launched our first batch of workshops. And I will put a link to our website in the description below if you're interested. We've got a beginner workshop where you're going to learn 12 foundational embroidery stitches and make a working clock. So that's our beginners workshop, and then we've got an intermediate workshop where we're going to be learning some applique skills and creating a woodland scene. And then we've got a more advanced workshop for people that want to learn to experiment with their embroidery and textile art, and we're going to make a landscape. And I will make a separate video showing you the kinds of things that you can learn in those workshops. I'm so excited. I'm not doing a big sales pitch, but I'm just sharing my enthusiasm and excitement because it's just feels like things are moving in the right direction, and I'm stepping into doing something that I really love. And Feather Stitch House was all about helping people rediscover their creative spark. That's why we exist. We do it through the medium of embroidery and textile art, but really what we're all about is helping you rediscover the fact that you are creative, whether you believe it or not. So you never need to tell a child to be imaginative or to be confident in their art. Anyone that's got small children in their life know that they tend to believe that everything they do is brilliant. So I have watched countless crazy dances and praised the most bizarre pieces of art that both of my children have come up with. I've listened to peculiar stories that are made up on the spot. And both my children have written books which are strange and wonderful and very childlike. And every time they have been totally confident that what they've created is a work of art, is a masterpiece. And something happens to us along the way that makes that shrivel up. And I spent quite a long time hearing people tell me that they didn't have a creative bone in their body and they're not a creative person and they're no good at creativity. And I just don't believe it. I don't believe it of anybody. I think we're all creative. We just lose our confidence. And so that's why Feather Stitch House exists. It's to help people get back in touch with that bit of themselves that they lost along the way. where we just invent and imagine and create and feel proud of what we've done, feel confident in what we've done. And it might not be perfect. My door's not perfect. I could go back and redo loads of it, but I did it and I worked it out and I'm pleased with it. And that's that's really what winging it's what Feather Stitch House is all about. And so the idea that I can gather groups of predominantly women together and help them rediscover their creativity, I can't tell you how joyful it makes me, and I hope you can hear it in my voice. I'm so excited. So if you are in the UK, if you're somewhere near Lincoln or are willing to travel, there are workshops available for you. And like I say, I'll do a video next week giving you a bit more detail about them, but I'll also link in the description below to the website so that you can go and have a look and find out some more information. So that's why we're making a door. What a long story. I hope you don't mind me rambling on while I'm stitching. So here we go. Here's my threshold. We're nearly there. Now I need to attach it to the background and make it open. So this is quite quick. I'm just going to do a really simple hinge on my door. So I just want a little strip of fabric. This is about 2 centimetres wide. And I want pieces that are about 7 or 8 centimetres long. You can go longer, but don't go shorter because you'll make it really hard for yourself. So what I'm going to do is fold in the edges to the centre. So I'm folding in both sides there to the centre, and I'm just going to press that, hold those in place. Sorry about the wobbly camera. I'm ironing enthusiastically. I'm just pressing that. Then I want to fold it in half so that I've got a fold at one end, the open ends at the other. I'm just going to press that again just to help it stay in place. And this is going to be our door hinge. This is how we're going to attach it to our background. So you'll notice that miraculously one hinge appears. I'm going to show you the second hinge because I actually decided on a better way of doing it on the second hinge. So this is the way I unpicked the first one and redid it like this. So I'm just going to put the folded edge of my hinge onto my door. I've got a knot in the end of my thread. It's the same thread that I used to do my hole bind stitch on the panelling. And I'm just pulling it through so the knot goes inside the door. And I'm going to do a French knot. Now, if you're not sure about French knots, I've got a tutorial. I'll put a card at the top of the screen. And I'm just going to do like an invisible tacking stitch on the back. So I've just got a tiny, tiny stitch, and I've slid my needle along inside the door and come up where I want my next French knot to be. So I'm working French knots on the front of the fabric, so they're meant to look like bolts or whatever. And then on the back, I'm doing a tiny little stitch just to hold that French knot in place. But I don't want a big French knot, or I don't want a big stitch showing on the back. And then I'll slide my needle inside the door and come out where I want my third French knot to be. And then on the back, I'm going to do a single wrap quilter's knot and then a tiny little invisible hem stitch and pull that knot through inside the layers of the door, and then I can snip off my thread. And that way I get my French knots on the front and I don't get untidy stitches on the back. I've just got 3 tiny, tiny little invisible tacking stitches. So I'm going to pin my door in place just to make sure I locate it properly. And I'm just going to put some quite rough tacking stitches through the rest of those hinges. So that's why we're creating the door, because I think even if you aren't at the point where you're making a massive life change, we're always on the edge of something. We're always stepping through from one phase of life to another. Think about what kind of door you want to make. think about the scene that you want on the other side of your door, and let's sort of honour those moments in our lives where changes take place. And I'm really looking forward to seeing your stories of threshold moments in your textile art. So yeah, that's where we're heading this month, and I hope that's okay. Thanks so much for watching and listening to my ramblings through this video. And yeah, do share your work. We're all creative, remember. Let's be proud of what we've done. So you can use hashtag FSHWingingIt24 on Instagram. Don't forget to tag me at Feather Stitch House. And if Instagram isn't for you, we do have a private Facebook group. I'll put information in the description below. I can't wait to see the doors and thresholds that you all make. So have a great week, and I will see you next week. Bye.